As an SME ourselves, Trade Ledger are all too aware of the difficulties that SMEs, smaller businesses, medium-sized enterprises, even the large corporates go through when they're trying to access financial services. This is a massively underserved market from the banking and financial services space. So SMEs to us are incredibly important from a personal perspective, from a company perspective, and improving access to financial services is the top of our agenda for when we're delivering our technology into banks. So Trade Ledger as a business is an API-based technology platform. We're an enterprise technology platform that services banks and financial services providers. Rather than being a fintech that tries to service consumers or SMEs directly, we're servicing consumers through the existing incumbent banks or through the existing alternative finance providers. There's a couple of strategies that we employ to increase access to financial services for SMEs. The first one is by creating a platform that is essentially serving a new market called lending as a service. So our technology, our enterprise B2B technology, is being utilised by banks to access new data sources. Those data sources are being pulled through into the platform, and those data sources are essentially what they're trying to solve the problem of data asymmetry in this space. Data asymmetry is one of the biggest issues that we see in the SME space that has led to that $2.1 trillion gap in working capital globally. So the first area that we are focused on as a business is lending, but as a API-based platform, actually what we're working in is a new ecosystem of banking. What we're creating in partnership with the banks and in partnerships with other financial services providers such as Banking Circle is a new ecosystem of financial services providers that might be providing lending, they might be providing payment services, FX, treasury. This new ecosystem or new market network is establishing a new era of financial services, which ultimately will better serve the customers, better serve the SMEs in the banking space. If we better serve the banking space through the incumbents, then the SMEs themselves will stand to benefit greatly from this, because they can access the types of services that they want, not just from their banks, but actually the banks can place this into other ecosystems. So we see massive examples of this with large big tech providers looking to partner with banks for distribution, with Apple and Goldman Sachs, with Cabbage in the US partnering with Alibaba. We see a number of different examples of large big tech providers partnering with banks for the benefit of SMEs, for the benefit of consumers, by accessing data, by accessing financial services at the real point of need. In this new ecosystem, we can actually provide a new environment that better serves the SME financial services space. A lot of SMEs, as defined by many of the banks, are what I would call businesses or directors of businesses moonlighting as businesses, sole traders, small companies. Much of that data on those businesses or on them directors is already available in the ecosystem, and they are actually quite well serviced by the banks. I think platforms like Trade Ledger are actually purpose-built to solve for a different market. For anyone with a turnover above $1 million, most banks in the UK would flick you from their retail banking or business banking ring-fence bank into what they would be calling corporate banking. And it's that gap that transcends the sort of ring-fencing, that gap that actually we're seeing a massive underserved market. So SMEs growing, fast growth companies like Trade Ledger that start to push past that £1 million turnover and start to become mid-market or start to become the larger SMEs, they're actually really badly underserved by existing banks. And this is where we've seen a large number of the challenger banks come in and start to challenge that market and actually start to service quite easily a base that was completely underserved. Now the trick to doing that is actually getting access to better data. And because we've seen this, because of things like Open Banking, because of PSD2, because of GDPR, and because of a large general migration into the cloud for other platforms, we now establish an environment where actually data is accessible and data is now transferable on the request of the SME himself. so him or herself. So once you get past that £1 million turnover, you do have data. You just have to be in a position to actually access that data and leverage it as an SME. So in itself, it's promoting that ecosystem model. It's accessing data, it's sharing data between platforms at the request of the SME. And ultimately, it's plugging that gap between what traditional banks might call the smaller SMEs, all the way up to the large corporates, into that larger turnover SMEs, even into multinational companies. They're all underserved past the tag of SME or past the smaller end of the turnover. Now that gap will start to be plugged. I think regulatory changes like open banking, like GDPR, like PSD2 certainly do create a better environment for ecosystem models. We see the UK made the move to implement an open banking strategy about 4 years ago now, and we've been about 18 months into our open banking journey. Now what we're starting to see on a global scale is other countries following us into this revolution. Not necessarily because the open banking movement has been proven, not because people are very comfortable with sharing data everywhere in the world now, but actually because other countries are viewing this as an economical disadvantage that they don't have an open banking environment established. So Australia have followed suit. Recently, the Senate in Canada have just approved an open banking program that will be implemented in 2020. All around the world, I think the flow of data is now helping to promote a better financial services industry within that country. If we start to connect up countries by these open banking programs, like we should see with PSD2 across Europe, then actually it will facilitate better trade. So the flow of goods, the flow of data, they're all interconnected, especially when you start to think about SMEs, when you've got a concept of a customer, a supplier, and a debtor working in this ecosystem, in this supply chain, back to my original point, in this supply chain, the flow of data between these ecosystem players or between these market actors is really important. And the better flow of data will ultimately facilitate better trade. So ultimately what we're seeing is programs like open banking being a catalyst for what we term open finance, and open finance being the global catalyst for better trade between countries. Financial inclusion should not just be a financial services problem, it should be a regulatory problem. It should be a government level drive towards a better ecosystem to stimulate technology, to stimulate SME services into banking, to stimulate financial services and banking itself. Recently this week we saw Mark Carney from the Bank of England announcing plans to support a new SME underwriting platform to solve the £22 billion gap in working capital. If you look at some of the stats over the last few years, when an SME applies to one of the top 6 banks, 50% of the time they are declined. That's a huge stat, a huge problem that we've got in the UK market specifically around financial exclusion of SMEs. If we can start to serve that with better access to data, whether it's a regulatory push like open banking, whether it's a drive by established players like the credit bureaus, or whether actually it's something driven by the Bank of England and something perhaps by Treasury, I think it will benefit everyone in the ecosystem if all market actors come together to promote financial inclusion within the SME space. These are the driving force of our economy is small SMEs. We've got 5.5, 6 million SMEs in the UK. They are actually the driving force of the UK economy. They are the driving force of the UK economy. So if we don't start to tackle financial inclusion in that space, we're going to be a long way behind the curve against other industries or other countries that are looking to tackle this problem, who have a very similar economical model like us, like Australia, a large proportion of SMEs, like US, like Canada, all driven by micro SMEs or fast growing SMEs that are moving and stimulating growth within their countries.